My name's Jordy Comis. I'm one of the co-hosts and co-producers of Barnstorming PA, and I'm really thrilled to have with me tonight Daryl Lewis, who has been a friend for several years, one of the people with some of the most interesting ideas about food, about culture, about social change that I've had the pleasure to meet. And I'm going to say he's an idea wrangler. I saw that in a job description once, and I thought I didn't get the job, but I was like, that's what I want to be when I grow up, is an idea wrangler. So I don't know if I've ever said that to you, Daryl, but hopefully you feel that the job title fits. And why don't you introduce yourself?
I could certainly be satisfied with being called an idea wrangler. My name is Daryl Lewis. I am the Assistant Secretary of the Wilkes-Barre NAACP, Assistant Secretary of ITT NEPA, and I am an affiliate of the Wilkes-Barre Area Community Garden.
Awesome. So Daryl had this great idea, which I'm trying to do now, that like this does stream out on several platforms, and we could relink it. So, oh, there it is. Okay. So I'm going to grab the link, Daryl.
Sure.
And I know that this is not like the highest quality content, but we are, as we like to say, artisanal podcasting. So, Daryl, there's a thing called private chat on your screen that's like a chat for us. So there's the Facebook link. Yeah. And did it snow today in Wilkes-Barre?
Yeah, we did have some snow. I woke up to the feeling of shock, awe, and disappointment. And generally speaking, I try to not go out if it's snowing if I don't have to. Where I live, they tend not to plow. And if I don't have to risk any sort of injury or damage to a vehicle, then I would rather not.
Right. My mother-in-law grew up, well, actually she went to graduate school, in Nashville. And I also myself happened to grow up in Knoxville. She told the story about in the 60s, there was, they get a lot of ice storms. And I feel like this is a bit of a climate change story, because like the weather we get in this area now is like what it was then, right? So it's like right around 31 degrees and a lot of ice, and I'm still a lot of snow. Anyways, big ice storm in Nashville. And in those days, everybody's cars were just rear wheel drive cars. That's hard to say, rear wheel drive cars. And they, a DJ got on the radio and said that because you have better traction when the drive is coming from the front, like the principal front wheel drive cars, everybody should drive backwards in the ice storm. And he was just like taking a piss. And she said all these people were driving backwards in the ice storm in Nashville.
Well, you see, I've accidentally driven backwards in an ice storm. I didn't start that way though, you know? So yep. I would personally recommend not doing that.
Excellent. Well, cool. So I actually, something that's not even on our agenda, but I had a chance to go this week to a conference put together by the Center for American Progress, which is a big national liberal, left-leaning think tank. And they, and there was somebody, I actually gave totally the wrong context. But I did do that, and I may bring it up later. Sorry, this is a thing I heard in another podcast, but I'm just curious what you thought, because honestly, like sometimes it's hard to say anything new about politics. You know, it's covered so much, and there's so many commentators. But this was, I think his name is Guy Burnham, and he was filling in for the podcast Love It or Leave It. But he said that, you know, until 1980, like when Reagan arrived, he was the first politician who really had a script, and he was like the hottest thing in town because he had a script, and everybody started emulating him. So we had 45, 50 years of every politician reading from a script, and then Trump came along, and he was the only person in the game who was working without a script, and that was the source of a lot of his power and charisma. And I was like, oh, like I thought that had some real like new insight. I was just curious to throw that out to you. What do you think?
I think we also have to keep in mind that before Reagan, there was this tradition of oration, and whether or not people had a script, the idea of having well-practiced speeches, talking points, and the ability to well, they would just call it orate rather than speak, was something that we don't teach or practice anymore. So it wasn't a script, it wasn't oration, it was natural, off the cuff, plain spoken, lowest common denominator speech. And we can all take something from the idea of lowest common denominator speech when we are addressing a crowd with no minimum educational requirements.
For sure. I mean, we're already deep into interesting things. I hear you. At the same time, sometimes I wonder if, like, I was just thinking about Lincoln actually, because of he's sort of often held up as a great orator, and as you're saying, that was really the only way to communicate, writing and speaking. And so, just like anybody who has a skill, whether it's artistic or athletic or something else, they're using it all the time, so they're very good at it. So when we read the speeches from the 19th century now, the sentences seem long, the paragraphs seem long, but the people then were very used to, like, that's how they absorbed information. But my thought was, like, maybe now, like with the 7-second, 15-second, 30-second, and visually based, your TikTok videos and shorts and all that, those are super important. I don't, of course they are, but like, the people who can edit and make those, right, are going to be the people who have a huge influence. You know what I'm saying? Like,
absolutely.
That's the oration of today. Mm-hmm.
Once upon a time, only a certain percentage of the population could read or write, and they created the truth. They created history. They created what people knew, shared, and spread. And even before that, it was the capability of telling an engaging and an exciting story, around a campfire or a fire. So the people who control the narrative will always have a certain degree of power and influence, but the format of the narrative has evolved yet again. And after TikTok, it's going to evolve again, because we're still playing with the idea of 3D information. We're playing with the idea of, can we tap into neurons and synapses and transmit information? I mean, I think it was an MIT experiment that just picked up on the ability to render images from dreams, So we are spiraling. TikTok is a benchmark, but it's not the end all be all. It's not going to be where we end up. But right now it is on top. And what we've learned from TikTok is people like short, digestible bursts of information. And there are a couple of principles in psychology that tell us that we can't learn consistently for more than 15 minutes at a time. We need a break. Yet all of our schooling and all of our courses are structured in 45 minutes plus, right? So if you look through comments on TikTok, after one 3-minute video, you'll always have several people saying, wow, I've learned this here for the first time. Never learned this in school. Or, oh, this makes so much more sense now that you've said it this way. We have people that are learning concepts and collecting ideas rapidly that the 45-minute format or the semester format failed to deliver.
Yes. At the same time, I think that it's important for people, like, to be able to develop the deeper skills that you need to be a great editor or a great writer, or,
Sure.
or to build a sustained work. You have to be able to, like that may be true about the consumption, but we still need people in a learning, either in the learning or an educational capacity. Or I was talking to a friend of mine last night whose son is learning film editing. He'll spend hours getting it just right. And even if it's something that's consumed a small amount of time.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't expect TikTok to teach a skill set,
Right.
But for the dissemination of information and the spread of information, it's got merit.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let me do a little bit of the housekeeping. So if you're new to the podcast, welcome. You can find us on most of the socials on your podcast player. We are making sure that we're on those. If you go to www.barnstorming.pa.org, you can get the archive of past episodes. We have a little bit of merchandise. We just started to break even last year, so that was kind of exciting. So we're covering our costs, and let's see, please like or subscribe, all of those things on any of the YouTube, Facebook, all the social media things. And of course, I wear a lot of hats. My adult children roll their eyes every time I say I'm a professional hat rack because of all the hats I wear. But these are just my opinions, and they in no way reflect any of the bodies I'm elected to, which includes the Lewisburg Council or people who employ me. I will just say the same thing applies for you, Daryl, right? You're speaking for yourself here.
Yeah.
I mean, unless you say otherwise.
No. I always speak for myself.
It's actually something, well, I'll just throw this out there, but let's not spend too much time on it. But I get kind of frustrated that, like, because of things like, the social medias and the Facebooks and the LinkedIn's, like, I was first on Facebook when it was really just students and young people, and you weren't quite sure you wanted to have your real life on there, right? Like, there was still a sense of, like, the ways in which something like Reddit or the Well from the beginning of the internet, like, you had a kind of pseudonymity, like a pseudonym identity that you could distance yourself. So it was like it was okay to maybe take a weird position or a controversial point of view. I mean, sometimes that goes way too toxic. Anyway, what I was going to say was, like, I find sometimes people are like, well, anything you do on any social media platform at any time is always like gain for anybody to say that, like, oh, well, you said that as yourself, so therefore your employer, blah, blah, blah. Like, can we all just, like, relax? Like, people are allowed to have different voices and different opinions in different contexts.
I feel like I was generationed into that so that some of us, I would say in my generation, had lost the desire to have a pseudonym and have really approached having one identity, for better or worse, because some of us have exposed entirely too much of our personalities, quirks, politics online, and that's burnt some of us maybe 10 years ago. Now it seems as if it's less of a public denunciation at work, or we
Hmm.
looked at your social media and we don't believe that you're a fit here. You hear that a lot less often,
Hmm.
but you also do hear when people are extreme and they are entirely inappropriate, then that's often grounds for their termination.
Right.
So having a belief, as long as it's not an extreme antisocial belief that really just doesn't fit anywhere, um, is no longer just no longer a pathway towards being
Hmm.
ostracized, but extremism still is.
Right. Right. That's a good point. Yeah, for sure. I remember back when I was teaching, um, hearing stories about employers saying, this is 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, saying, well, maybe not 20, but 10 or 15, we saw on Facebook that you were at a party drinking. And I was saying to myself,
Yeah.
5 years ago, you were hiring people who were 21 or 22, and I'm sure that their behaviors were the same. It's just that now, like, this is new information that doesn't tell you anything about this person's ability to do this job. So what's the point? Including, like, I feel like sometimes where, the burden was always like, what have you posted? And I feel like as a society, we should ask the question, why have you looked?
Yeah. And I've had an employer. Well, it wasn't an employer. I'm not going to blame the whole company. I had a director who would use your social life against you if they felt that when they wanted to encroach on your personal life to ask you to do something for work, you were unavailable because you were enjoying your, you know, whatever quintessential elements that make you a human, you know? So they wanted to damage your work-life balance, and they would use the fact that they knew what you were doing in your social life against you, you know?
Yeah.
And uh, it was a very competitive work environment, and unfortunately, I don't think that that would have gotten them terminated then. I
Mm.
think now that behavior would be seen as inappropriate because I
Mhm.
think now a lot of people are starting to really talk about work-life balance, compare salaries, and defend people's right to be human a little bit more than something that is work as a primary and family and identity as a second and
Hmm.
tertiary.
For sure. No, that's a great point. I want to back up and just kind of ask you uh, a question that because I was linking to some of the things you're involved with the NAACP branch in. Did I use the right word, branch?
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, in Wilkes-Barre, I noticed that the handle was Diamond City NAACP, and I was like, huh. So you told me before we got on that I've never heard Wilkes-Barre called the Diamond City. So
Yeah, Scranton, I believe, is the Electric City,
hmm.
and Wilkes-Barre is the Diamond City. These are terms that go back hundreds of years outside of the NAACP. I suppose in the same way that New Jersey is the Garden State and
Hmm.
Pennsylvania is the Keystone State. So we thought that there might have been, and this is in particular the previous president, Jamel. We thought that there was some potential in attracting a younger crowd for people of color
Hmm.
by having kind of a more exciting, more vibrant, more attractive name. We also wanted a name that didn't seem bound to just Wilkes-Barre. Yes,
Hmm.
Diamond City is a name for Wilkes-Barre, but it also would perhaps allow people in Edwardsville, Kingston, so on and so forth,
Right.
to feel like Diamond City is something that they can represent and be part of, wear the shirt for, feel connected to. Whereas somebody in Edwardsville or Hazleton, they might feel excluded by the name Wilkes-Barre, but not excluded by the name Diamond City.
Right. No, that's great. I'm glad I asked. I didn't know that much had gone into it. Um, I just Googled for what it's worth that it has some roots in the whole anthracite period and the coal being so valuable. I guess it
Okay.
was like diamonds. But um, yeah, I think that is a great thing to do to build those kinds of identities that invite people to think about not just the narrow place they're from, but the broader region. And it can take time. I first moved to Bethlehem in the mid '90s, and they were just then Lehigh Valley is for the all three cities was just coming
Hmm.
in, and some of the people who were natives or old timers were a little bit like, well, that's not really. We're all distinct places, but having been back there 30 or 30 years later, it is a little bit more. People see it as a regional identity, which is not to say you lose whatever is fun and quirky about Ashley or Kingston or Drums or Plains. Lord knows we have some weird and amusing place names in Pennsylvania. I wanted to kind of step back and use this opportunity to hear your story because we first met in 2020. I'm pretty
Hmm.
sure around the different protests that were going on because of the Black Lives Matter explosion, eruption, surge, uh, and I never really got a chance to hear. You mentioned New Jersey. You want to just kind of tell your story about how you came to be the Daryl who was getting very involved in social and community and political things.
Sure. Let me fast forward through all the education and personal origin, so on and so forth. And let's talk right about activism and how that started.
Mm-hmm.
I was never politically or socially active. I was always aware, relatively aware. I would say that perhaps an average, maybe above average understanding of how things work. But even at the age of 33, you could have asked me 33, which was, right around 2019. You could have asked me, what does the Senate do? What does Congress do? What's a city council? What's a county council? What's a controller? What's a county manager? How many judges? What types of judges? What types of courts?
Mm-hmm.
I had no concept of civics on a greater level, right? Which means I had no operational, no working knowledge. Couldn't really tell you how to get a bill passed. Um, I was controlled by a system that I didn't understand how it operated, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't matter to me because I had the assumption that there were enough people participating in this system with good intentions, adequate intelligence, and the ability to make the changes that I wanted. And after George Floyd, it became very apparent to me that the people that I believed were part of the system and already involved were not.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't exactly George Floyd that did it, or Breonna Taylor, or
Mm-hmm.
Ahmaud Arbery. They were all happening right at the same time. They were all in the back of my mind. My breaking point, and it was a literal breaking point, was I was watching Django Unchained. You know, I've seen it before. I liked it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, I was watching it again, and I'm like halfway through, and Quentin Tarantino is not admiring anybody's feet at this point or anything like
Mm-hmm.
that. He's whipping somebody, and he's just getting this sick, deranged, frenzied pleasure out of whipping somebody, and
Mm-hmm.
just the idea that he's there causing this fevered suffering that he's delighting in,
Mm-hmm.
and that was the tipping point.
Hmm. Was that summer or that that year?
Yeah, it was that year, and I actually found myself kind of tearing up while I watched it.
Hmm. I forgot he was in the movie, but he plays one of the like white overseers, right? And then
Hmm.
uh, is he shot by
I can't
uh,
remember.
Jamie Foxx's character? Jamie Foxx, right? He plays
Maybe I'll watch it again. Who knows?
yeah. I mean,
Um,
I do think it's a great movie. I heard an interview once where uh, I'm not somebody who thinks that Tarantino is like the greatest thing ever, but I do think he can make some really good movies. But this
sure.
person was kind of falling for the like, do you feel bad about making something that's so violent? And he was like, whatever you think is horribly violent in my movie, it is
Yeah,
nothing compared to the real experience. And I really appreciated that comment.
yeah. And then when I learned even more, because I thought that I had a pretty good concept of how terrible it was, then
Hmm.
you learn more,
Hmm. Right.
and then you realize that it was really a period of human depravity, and there were everything from uh, sexual assaults all the way
Hmm.
to cannibalism.
Right.
So it was genuinely in terms of recorded history, a low point. You know, and
Yeah.
I think the idea that some people took such joy in that low point, that was a look at darkness unlike that
Hmm.
I think I've seen before. And then when you see what was happening with George Floyd, so on and so forth, you realize that that potential still exists in our society. We haven't evolved beyond that. And with the weaknesses and inefficiencies in our systems, we are all still at risk of sliding into that or into some evolution of that where a different group or a different race is subjected to new horrors, terrors, and exploitations. And as far as I'm concerned, no one should be subjected to those exploitations and horrors.
So I appreciate you sharing that. I guess one question I was wondering was like for you, and if this is too nosy, we say in Spanish "tenemos confianza," like we trust each other. You'll tell me, but like either before or after Django, was there like did that raise an interest for you in like what is my story? Like how does my family intersect with that horrible history, or is that something you grew up with, like within your family, the people talking about how things were?
My family is from Trinidad, and yes, all that existed there. But in terms of our records and our family lineage and information sharing, we don't know very much about the exact details of anything, frankly.
Hmm.
So we really only can trace maybe 3 generations before me on probably either side.
Hmm.
Um, so we don't have one of those large tomes with a family crest dating back and telling the exploits of every noble family member, so on and so forth. And like I've always been impressed by things like that, but that's never been my reality. That's never been my world. Um,
Well, that's funny. I mean, I think some amount of almost always going to be white people. I think in the United States who have those. Sometimes somebody sold them. It's like you can get your family crest.
oh yeah, yeah. Um, but I think the one day I'll probably, and I've done the ancestry.com thing.
Hmm.
Um, we haven't really found anything. Um, Maybe some second and third cousins, but no real trace to before that wall, and that wall would be 3 or 4 generations back for us.
So I didn't know about the Trinidad. So was that your parents or your grandparents immigrated?
Parents, both of them. They met over here though. However, they're both from different parts of Trinidad.
Hmm. Interesting. So, like, do you go back? Did you go back as a kid, some?
Did go back as a kid. Would like to go back as an adult. I have a very distinct picture of me in my head on a beach surrounded by coconuts, mangoes,
Hmm.
and what they call roti.
Hmm.
Just it's kind of like a wrap, but with
Hmm.
very buttery and layered naan. Like
Hmm.
it's like folded naan bread, because Trinidad is like an infusion
Of
of
course.
cultures, like Western African,
Hmm.
Indian, native, and then you have a little bit of Chinese sprinkled on top. So,
Hmm.
and that tells a story of the Western African slaves that were brought in, the Indian indentured servants that were brought in after them, and then the
Hmm.
Chinese indentured servants that were brought in after the Indians. And
Hmm.
that also tells a story of how much people were paid or not paid. The indentured servants being slaves have, I'm sorry, the Africans being slaves and not being paid, the
Hmm.
Indians being paid, and the Chinese being paid as well. And then after things started to change and people were no longer working in that capacity, the people of color there had no savings, no money. The Indians and the Chinese had money and could buy property, could start businesses, so on and so forth. And that created a little bit of a class system, from what I
Hmm.
understand there too.
Hmm.
Um, but anyway, there was and plus all the European influences from the people who were there and who owned land. So it was Spanish, French, and English, plus African, Indian,
Hmm.
Chinese, and the natives. So it
Hmm.
was it was an interesting cultural mix. But anyway, coconuts, mangoes,
And
and
roti.
roti with a lot of stewed meat inside of it too.
Yeah,
Curry.
no, yeah, that sounds amazing. Um, I actually took a course in college that was called something like the South Asian Diaspora, and
Mhm.
we read the V.S. Naipaul novel, and that for me, I haven't had the pleasure of visiting Trinidad, but um, I have been. I did study abroad in Costa Rica, and one of the things I think that many Americans don't realize is like that whole story of different cultures and peoples who had different paths, many of them horrible, right? But coming to like that's a very America, not United States of America, but all of the Americas
Yeah.
kind of story. So as an example of that, my Spanish professor in Costa Rica, his name was Eduardo, very Spanish sounding, Estovanovich. And also there they had a version of like a Chinese rice dish that was because Chinese indentured servants had been brought to Costa Rica to build railroads, and a little small piece of the population.
I think not a lot of people realize that there were Chinese indentured servants brought into a lot of different parts of the Caribbean. So that's something that I didn't know at first, and when I found out that there were, like Chinese people in Trinidad, it kind of blew my mind. And yeah, but I love maybe that's why I love cultural infusions as much as I do. As you said, you've seen the things that I post about on Facebook. It's often food from different cultures and bizarre combinations that I would love to try.
So, so speeding up. I mean, I just want to dig in a little bit more. I mean, you grew up in New Jersey, though, right?
Yeah, grew up in New Jersey, went to college in Long Island. Then I moved to Pennsylvania and went to school a little bit more in Pennsylvania. Then I moved back to New Jersey and started working in Manhattan, and then I moved back to Pennsylvania.
Yeah. So, did you have you had experiences of being, either places in New Jersey or schools you went or visiting Trinidad? Like, I mean, it sounds like you probably had experiences where it was majority Black or African descended, and then others were obviously like where you live in Wilkes-Barre, like, you're like numerically minority. Like I've seen you be very good at sort of building bridges across different groups. I'm just curious if you had a lot of experience with that growing up.
I've lived in everybody's community at some point or another. I've lived in fairly affluent white communities. I've lived in fairly broke Hispanic and Black communities. Lived in predominantly Jewish neighborhoods. Like I'm pretty comfortable around just everybody, frankly.
Right.
And I consider that to be a power and a fortune of mine. So it's not just race, it's not just religion, it's not just economic. I've had the pleasure of being immersed in all of them. And I will also say I've had the ability to probably introduce all of them to a person of color at a time where some of them may have not had that exposure. And again, I believe that exposure is the key to unlocking humanity, So until people have exposure, all they understand are the whispers of other people in their bubble and what they get from media. And in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the media was not too kind in portraying people of color.
Yeah. I have this thing that just since we're sharing a little bit, I like I said, I grew up in East Tennessee in Knoxville, which historically was like a lot of Appalachia, overwhelmingly white. That part of Tennessee wasn't part of the plantation economy, which is not to say it wasn't connected to it. It was transportation hubs, but I think Knoxville, when I was growing up, was 9 or 10%, mostly African American, like what we would say is people of color. I was about to say non-white because that's how we counted it then. So yeah, the high school I went to had when I graduated 100 people, nobody who was African American. There were some Asian American classmates, a couple of South Indian classmates. And that was a little unusual for that school. Like it wasn't like the whole school was like that. But all this is saying, and I definitely grew up in a family where my parents would have been like, you never use the N word. It's bad to be racist, right? Like that was clearly my parents' values. But what I say now is, for me, I had to learn to be more comfortable just talking about race and the lived realities of people. So it doesn't help white people to talk about race, to not talk about race. Right. And so an extension of that is, like you said, and picking up what you said about the humanity, it's so important to be able to have just some friends, some connections, some acquaintances. And at the same time, I've had the honor of knowing a lot of African-American, friends like yourself and other people who work in progressive change. And sometimes they'll talk about the emotional work, right, of having to be there and like talk to white people or talk about the experience. And I get that that's a real thing. And so here's this crazy thing. There's just a numerical problem, right? Like if one thing that would really help white Americans of good faith is to be able to have a black friend, let's say, and just hear me out, right? There's just not enough, right? That's asking too much of all of the black people. And I feel like we don't talk about that sometimes. Is that weird?
Well, again, it's the topic of exposure. And yeah, I mean, if everybody knew somebody that they were comfortable with that showed them all the right things, then yes, we would be all wonderful, things would work. And but I mean, with things like redlining and redlining and sundown towns and keeping people in ghettos and excluding people from work,
Mm-hmm.
how that couldn't have happened. Keeping people, separating schools, and even now we're separating schools, but we're doing it in mixed areas. We're closing down schools, shoveling people into a single school, then opening up a charter school or a private school where only certain people can afford to go. And because you're creating a class or a price barrier, it is also coming with a race barrier. And now we've reintroduced the segregation of schools.
For sure. And going back to what you were saying about the low moment in human history with the chattel slavery in the South, and you know, and at the same time, I mean, the British can say like, well, we ended slavery sooner. It's like, you did, but come on, you know, like the whole empire was built on a lot of like horribleness.
Well, okay, but correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't the British and the French, aren't they still receiving reparations from slavery for the loss of property, which means having to free people? Haiti is paying reparations to France.
I thought Haiti had just finished a couple of years ago, but you're absolutely right that Haiti was forced. I mean, most of the problems with Haiti as an economy, I feel like is fair to say it has to do with that. But I didn't know. I mean, I wouldn't doubt it. I wouldn't doubt it at all. And that is crazy. And it gets back to the, you know, when people have economic incentives to be that awful to each other, that's when we see it, which was kind of the link I was trying to make. And what you're saying now about redlining and the sundown towns, and I was even trying to move back to George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, and more recently Tyree Nichols. That like the when policing is clearly has a racist element, it's not just because they're bad people. There's structural and economic things baked into it. That's what I was trying to get to.
Absolutely. And talking about the issue with policing, I'm going to say it probably on every platform that I can. When you have privatized prisons
Mm-hmm.
that have the ability to fine a government, which means charge them, if the privatized prison has open beds, they can fine the local government a certain amount of money because of those open beds. So when that happens, there's pressure from that local government on the police to increase the arrests.
Mm-hmm.
Now you have police pushing pushing their stops and their interactions to find a reason to arrest somebody. And sometimes when somebody becomes agitated during that interaction, they claim that they are resisting arrest, which then warrants an arrest.
Mm-hmm.
So we have this pressure on these police to perform in the field. And who are they going to take? Are they going to take affluent white children who
Mm-hmm.
likely have families that can hire lawyers and put pressure and create problems? Or are they going to take people who generally, when they go missing, there might even be a social expectation that that's where they belong?
Yeah.
And then you take a look at Luzerne County, 2000 to 2010, approximately 40% of the African American population was incarcerated. I will send you a link. I'm going to put the link in the chat. Let me pull that up.
Sure. Totally. I mean, after the Black Lives Matter protests in Ferguson, which was for, and I hate that this happens to me. I don't remember. Was that George Taylor? No. Anyway, it was Ferguson, just outside of St. Louis. The Justice Department went in and did a deeper study, and they found that that Ferguson city, that was basically part of the greater St. Louis, a huge proportion of its city revenues for its budget to like pay for roads and stop signs and other things was from policing, right? So they had a huge economic incentive to do traffic stops, give people silly citations. And I'm not an expert on this, but there's all these other layers. There's all these fees that get stuck in if people miss a court date, and then they go into debt, and all of this. So,
Jordan, you can do a share screen, right?
Yeah.
Do me a favor. Pop open that link and share the screen.
Okay. I said that, and it's been a little while since I used this software, so just give me half a sec. Oh, yeah. There we go. Cool. Yep. Okay. But what are we looking for?
So in 2000, right?
Mm-hmm.
Census reported population. Actual population. All right. Actual population, Black, 3,731. Incarcerated population, 1,677. That means every other Black person in 2000 was being arrested.
Yeah. And part of the, to me, the horrible piece of that, thank you for sharing that, comes back to like, why are local governments so strapped for cash, right? Because we've been living under this idea, usually kind of starts with Reagan, of like, government is always bad, it can never do anything good, it should always be cut. It's like, well, we say that, but then, but people, I'm on my local borough council, people want the sidewalks dealt with, they want the roads dealt with, they want parks nice, they want treatment. I want those things too. And if you think that taxing is always bad, then suddenly these people are trying to figure out how to raise revenue. The other one then is most local government. It's, if you thought of it as a business, it's providing services. Most of the budget is employees. Healthcare keeps going up so fast, right? So then it goes up faster than inflation. So we're basically, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I think a lot of the problem with all of that is the same problem that I had. The assumption that the right people were motivated to run for these positions and were of the quality, character, and caliber to make these changes. And they're not. And even somebody who high school educated, college educated, right, took political science classes, in college, but they still didn't teach me the civics that I needed to understand the flow of power and how it related to me.
But I think I don't love civics because I feel like it has the connotation of a system that works where power didn't matter. So I'm more and more trying to talk about how do you build power and use power. So it's interesting to me. I don't know if more civics education, at least how I think of it, and maybe I'm being unfair in the way it's normally taught, would actually have given the young Daryl or the young whoever what they wanted in terms of how the system works.
Sure. Well, regardless of label, I think people need to learn how the system works, how it's related to them, and how they can become involved and impact it.
Right. On that, I wanted to, I just literally wanted to hear more too, because, from what I'm aware of, you're spending a lot of your time on things that somebody would say like maybe isn't obviously political or policy. I'm thinking about the garden and some of the other things. I'm not saying that, but I just was, can you tell me the story about how you went from, the Django and 2020 to like putting a lot of your energy into those things?
Sure. How does one go from sitting on their couch, tearing up, watching Quentin Tarantino whip somebody, to planting turnips?
Yeah. That could be the title of your memoir.
Yeah, so that's a pretty good question when you put it that way. It went with learning what the moving parts of a society were. Um, and once you realize all of the functions and factions that are involved, you're going to understand that not everything is controlled in a linear fashion, right? So, uh, a system, everything is correlated in order to function, right? So, much like, let's do a transition from Django to Jenga, right?
I mean, yes, you have my full attention.
What a segue.
I
So,
mean, I think that's the episode title right there.
from Django to Jenga. Okay.
Yes. Hmm.
So Jenga is a stack of interconnected, interwoven blocks. And the idea is to make moves and stack it up as high as you can without destroying the entire system, right?
Hmm.
But there are a lot of interesting moves that you can do, you know? You can take your block and you can push out another block. Nobody says that's in the rules, but you can do it, you
Hmm.
know? And your hand might be too shaky to pull a block from the bottom, but if you use another piece to insert and support, well, you can do that too, right? So when it comes to the garden, food security and hunger, that's a major contributing factor to everything. The entire human starts with what we're eating, what we have over our heads. So food and housing, not only are they what we need, but they're also staples in wealth production and creation.
Hmm.
So one, the ability to produce food has always been the ability to generate money in this country. Two, owning property has always been the ability to stop paying rent and a landlord and to save enough money to start your own business, buy a vehicle, stop paying these third party people and to start saving, stop living paycheck to paycheck and to start saving. Afford enough savings to send your kids to school or some sort of certification or trade, so it is the foundation of wealth building. But when you take a look at these kids, a lot of kids, I'm sorry, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it was something like 20 to 30% of kids are like starving. So when you think about it, you know,
Hmm.
kids that you walk by every single day do not have enough food. And you can't tell by looking at them, and they're not going to run up and tell you, but they don't have enough food. So there are a lot of kids that are going to school, and some of these kids are so hungry that they can't think and they can't focus. And now I believe schools are doing a much better job with feeding kids, but there were periods of times where that funding didn't exist. And then welcome to the inequities. You have two kids that have similar family structures, only one is being fed and the other one's not being fed. The one that is not being fed, they're exposed to poor education because they can't focus, the likelihood of crime, doing strange or unpredictable things for money or food, including stealing. Uh,
Hmm.
What are their prospects? Whereas the other kid, they're eating, they're growing, they're developing, they're athletic, they're studying, they don't have to turn to crime because they don't have that element of desperation. So the idea that we all have yards, and most of these yards that are about a quarter acre, even an
Hmm.
eighth of an acre, can
Hmm.
produce like 1,000 pounds of food.
Hmm.
So any neighborhood could probably produce enough food to sustain the neighborhood.
Right. I mean, so, but I mean, you're doing this, right, in Wilkes-Barre? Can you tell me more?
Yeah, sure. So we have one garden. It's about an eighth of an acre. We have a Facebook group. We're just shy of 1,000 people. We've applied for some grants. Hopefully, we're going to get some this year. But for free, what we've been doing for free and just volunteer work, we've produced probably a few 100 pounds of food. A lot of tomatoes, a lot of leafy greens. And that
There's
was with,
nothing like a homegrown tomato, but keep
oh
going.
my God, yes. And that was before we had, now we have some more structural items. So this year, I hope we're going to produce about double, you know?
Is it near your house?
No, it's not near my house. It's kind of like in the center of Wilkes-Barre.
Okay.
It,
And
it's not
why did you pick that location, or how did that location get picked?
because
Or
it was there.
right? Is it an
Because
empty? Was it
that's
donate?
correct.
Mhm.
It was an empty lot. It was an empty lot that was not essentially. It was kind of donated, kind of purchased. It was purchased by a private citizen, and they're allowing us to use it. And we are trying to establish a system with Wilkes-Barre because Wilkes-Barre apparently has maybe 6 or 7 other gardens, but they're
Mhm.
not as productive or as effective as ours.
Hmm.
So if we get those 6 or 7 other gardens with our team, and if we happen to get a little bit of funding, we're really going to rock Wilkes-Barre.
Um, like at least last growing season, like on a good day, like who's out in the garden? Like people in the neighborhood, people from all over the city.
People
If I
from all
come
over the
home,
city.
mhm,
Yeah. So, people from all over the city. I don't know if we've had anyone travel for. Well, there are people from Dallas that come.
mhm. By the way,
So
for people who are out, this is Dallas, Pennsylvania, not Dallas, Texas.
that's correct. Yes, Dallas, Pennsylvania. People from Dallas come. I think the most people I've ever seen working at once has been like 10. There are children running around,
Hmm.
pulling up beets and turnips and washing them off and eating them, and it's really as organic and wholesome as you can imagine. You know,
Yeah, I don't know if I've ever had a raw turnip. Does it taste good?
depends on the type of turnip.
I see. Okay.
Yeah,
Um, no, that's great. And was this like learning about gardening and food growing? Was that like a new skill set for you, a new body of knowledge, or was it something you brought with you to from your
absolutely,
travels?
absolutely new to me. It's something that our main gardener is Jess Latier.
Hmm. Oh,
She's absolutely amazing. She knows so much,
hmm.
like it's her nerd passion, right?
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
there are certain people that are nerds or geeks about something and they can just infinitely rattle off information. Her nerd geek passion is organic, sustainable growing.
Hmm. Well, and going back to the hunger thing, I mean, we could do a whole podcast, but like, and we see it every day, so I forget how stark it is. But we have all of these, households that are hungry, and as you said, kids who are hungry, or getting enough calories, but eating horrible food, right?
Yeah,
So the ways in which we built a system that this processed food, is apparently cheaper. I say apparently because this is the economics I've had. All of the costs about poor nutrition, about being overweight. We have both a starvation epidemic and an obesity epidemic, and I think that like confuses us because it's like, how can that be? But it's because of all of these things about the kind of food that's produced, and even thinking about, what you're saying. I mean, a lot of kids, they don't know that food grows in the ground and that you can eat it, and so just in and for people who don't know, Wilkes-Barre is an urban environment. So for these kids who are there, that be able to connect to the earth and to the ecosphere. I mean, I think that's a huge upside too.
and there's a next step that I'm really trying to learn, and I hope that we can establish a little facility on one of these properties. I want to set up a barn, and in that little barn, it's barnstorming, so you should love where this
Yeah.
is going, right? In that barn, I want it to be an urban indoor farm using hydroponics. And just in case people don't know, hydroponics is a way to set up a pump and a fluid system so you can grow in a medium that is not soil. So you do not need soil in order to grow plants. What you can do is take a cup kind of with a spongy material, and you can let your seed after it's opened up, you can let your seed live there. The roots will continue to grow. The roots will touch that stream of water, that pump system, and then your plant will keep growing. And this way you can control the percentage of what nutrients are introduced to your plant in your system. So it tends to create uh, bushier and more nutritionally dense vegetation.
Hmm. Well, and another thing that sometimes I think we are up against some sort of basic like human evolution biochemistry, which is like, we like salt and fat, like they taste really effing good. And so, if people are like, well, Americans will never replace hamburgers with Brussels sprouts. I'm like, yeah, of course, like a hamburger, and I love a good hamburger, don't get me wrong. But what I'm trying to get to is like that food that's freshly grown, and especially if you had a hand in it, it just tastes better.
It
You
does
know.
taste different because things that we buy from the stores, they do a variety of things to, one, stop the growth cycle, two, stop it from releasing certain hormones, three, stop the seeds from being viable. So they do coating it in wax,
Hmm.
freezing and unfreezing it. Most of the things that you've eaten in a grocery store do not taste like the plants that come straight from a tree or straight out off the ground, you
Right.
know?
Right.
So you're missing a lot of nutrients and you're missing the whole flavor. The first time that I really understood this is when I bought a peach from an orchard, and I became a little obsessed, right?
Yes. Yes.
Because
In fact, my eyes got big because this is I'm gonna go off, not that there was a script, but I have a little set of questions that I just like to ask people, and
sure,
it's sort of bad survey research, bad in the sense that I ask all the people and I'm not being systematic, but this is one of them. Like, what's a piece of fruit that when it's perfectly ripe, like just
mm,
perfectly ripe, is the piece of fruit that is just, it's like heaven, it's transcendental, you want it no matter what. So peach is mine, honestly, but
honestly, and peach might be mine as well, but it wasn't until I actually had, a
mhm,
fresh organic peach.
right.
Until then, I thought peaches were flavorless and crunchy.
Yeah, right.
But
Crazy.
that's just because that's the best I was ever able to get
Right,
at a grocery store, you know?
right, right. So here's the fun thing. Almost no one says banana. I used to say no one, and I've asked maybe 100 people this or something like that. And then last summer, one of our canvassers was like, a banana. And I was like, get out of here. You're the only person who's ever said a banana.
That might be because the bananas that we're accustomed to are not the bananas that were first most
Right,
commercially available.
right.
So it was probably a tastier banana, but they were prone to an illness and essentially were wiped out
I,
because of
I've
the
had I've had some amazing bananas
yeah,
in tropical climates. Yeah, and
yeah.
they are good. I do. This is me nerding out on food. I think that bananas don't have as many different layers of flavor. Even a very good banana is still a bit sort of that kind of single flavor, whereas like a peach, you're getting a lot of floral flavors and sweet. But the thing is, this person, and I don't want to say his name because I don't want to feel bad. Like, I think it said more about his bland taste buds because he had never had one of those really good bananas you were talking about.
And not to dwell too much on bananas, but I believe that there is a banana that takes like vanilla ice cream that I've been very excited to stumble across one day.
Never heard that. Well, I want to just kind of I sort of advertise we might get a little bit into nerd culture. I'm just going to ask you to define this term blerd, blerd, because I only heard it a few years ago, but I was glad I'd heard it. But can you give us your understanding of?
Sure, it's one of my favorite word smash ups. It's a black nerd, blurred, you know. Um, phew, so I think a lot of people like labels more than they should,
Mhm.
and I think a label helps somebody identify themselves because it's hard to encapsulate the entire vibe of your personality or your
Mm-hmm.
identity.
Mm-hmm.
But I know that when I was growing up, we had people that obviously identified as rock or jocks or hip hop or
Mm-hmm.
so many people had their respective identities, and some of
Mm-hmm.
them played into them as if that was the core of their personality. And I know that I didn't really feel like I listened to a lot of different music, right? But imagine being a black guy who grew up in a predominantly white area in the 90s, right? There's always this expectation. Can you rap? Do you know the
Mm-hmm.
rap? Can you tell
Mm-hmm.
us about the raps? It's like, do
Mm-hmm.
you know the rappers? Like,
Oh, like, did you personally know them?
exactly, right?
Oh, I thought they just like that. They assumed you liked that music.
No, 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 no. The assumptions would go pretty far, right? so so
It's the classic. Oh, I know somebody from Texas. Like, oh, really? It's a state of
after
30
middle
million.
school, I didn't even really listen to a lot of rap music
Yeah.
because a lot of the content I thought was just kind of
Mm-hmm.
repetitive and it didn't appeal to me.
Mm-hmm.
So I listened to a lot of different types of music. But I remember going to the Warp Tour when I was 14 with some friends, right? And I was like one of the only black people
You
there.
got to educate me. What's the Warp Tour?
The Warp Tour, it's just like a general punk, emo,
Gotcha.
alternative music fest.
Mm-hmm.
It was in Asbury Park in the year 2001, right?
Gotcha.
So we went, and one of them pointed out, like, you're like one of the only black guys here, and he's like, that's really punk rock, and I'm like, okay, whatever. I didn't identify with any of those things, and I was a nerd, but I don't think I was the same type of nerd, you know, that my other nerd friends were. Like Blurred, it's a lot of anime,
Mm-hmm.
but funny enough, Blurreds also work out, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Like Blurreds are this combination of black culture and nerd culture,
Mm-hmm.
not just nerd culture, which is white culture and nerd culture, you
Right.
know? So there's a lot of hip hop influence. There's a lot of working out and health concerns, and there's a political element and political knowledge too,
Yeah.
because whereas a lot of people say vote for our rights, in our world it's vote or die.
Mm-hmm.
So there are a lot of different elements in what is generally black and wear that enter nerd for us.
I mean, like I know for me, I think Wu Tang Clan was big in the '90s, maybe.
They were
Um,
blurs, yeah.
yeah, right. And I sort of vaguely was read their music, and then there seemed to be these influences, and like this is me, sort of, how white am I? Just being like, oh, right, like, oh, I guess, like some of the anime and also some of the I've sort of bled into kung fu stuff. Um,
So why I think I'm picking up on the question,
It
right?
wasn't a question. It was just me kind of
Okay.
like later in life realizing that like, black kids my age or younger, older, like they also had the comic books and other things, had different experiences sometimes, or there were even, let's say, like I think X-Men is one of the classic ones where like I was an adult before I was like, oh, this is a metaphor for being an outsider, right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
duh.
And
Like so any young person who identifies with that could find all kinds of ways. So uh
I think there's something about anime and anime characters that appeal a lot to people of color,
mhm.
which is most of the anime characters eventually always tap into a hidden power or something inside, right? And I think for people of color who are often judged immediately,
Mhm.
showing who they really are on the inside is that evolution or that character arc or that growth of tapping into the inner power and eventually being able to show it to everybody else.
Mhm.
So I think for Blurreds, that's why so many of us were just turned on by Dragon Ball Z at that new level, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I could see how Dragon Ball Z is campy and corny and weird,
Mm-hmm.
but I can also see how there's this potent idea of having been judged, having being beaten down, having lost, and then coming back stronger, showing who you really are, and letting that be the key to winning everyone and everything over.
Right, right. Um, do you have like, we talked a little bit offline. Yeah, anime's not ever been because then once we get into nerd culture, there's like lots of sub varieties, and I've always been more into sci-fi than fantasy, for example, or in among the Action Together staff, we have Star Wars people and Star Trek. Not that we don't get along, but
By the
some
way, I'm
similar.
a Star Trek person.
Oh, you are? Okay. So it's you and Alicia.
Yeah.
Jess and I are more Star Wars. I mean, I like Star Trek a lot too, but it's not like I've seen every single series. In fact, I had Paramount Plus for a little while, and I was really looking forward to some of the newer ones. Like there's one with an actor, I think her name's Sonequa Green, who was on The Walking Dead, which I liked a lot. But it was like I was paying for Paramount Plus, but then there were commercials also, and I was like, I'm not having this, right? Like if I'm paying for your streaming service, I don't want need the commercials.
I think I've watched Star Trek on Paramount Plus, Prime, and Netflix all at some point, but I have some downloads too.
So here's what, and I know you're not prepped for this, but is there like anything, and I'm using text broadly, video game, movie, series, graphic novel, anime, book, like is there something, for you that was like a real foundational thing, and then something that you're looking forward to like reading or getting your hands on, right? So I'll give you an example. For me, I mean, Star Wars is like trite, but it's true. But I was 5 when the first Star Wars came out, and the whole idea of fighting the Empire. But I'll also say there was a book called Red Mars by Kim Stanley Robinson that I think came out in the 90s that I thought was, in fact, some of the stuff you were talking about with systems, right? Like as a writer, he's one of the best ones looking at the intercomplexity of these systems and being able to, I think there's a relationship between imagining positive social change and speculative fiction or science fiction, because in that world building, you're imagining what are the possibilities, for humans. So that's one. And looking forward to, I just recently, like yesterday, was listening to Pod Save the People, which is a podcast that's very focused on BIPOC and African American issues. And they're talking about this book, Faces at the Bottom of the Well by Derek Bell. And that's a name I had known, I think, from my academic background. He was a legal scholar and law professor, but I'm pretty sure this is a work of fiction. Have you ever heard of it?
No, I haven't.
And in it, he's telling kind of very allegorical stories. So like, but making a lot of points about race and identity, America, and all those things we were talking about. But one of them, for example, they were talking about a story, if I got this right, is like there's a like island that just appears in the middle of the Atlantic, and it's like bountiful, everything you could want. And for some reason, the only people who can live there are African Americans. Right. And no one else. And so like the sort of moral question is, would you move there? Right. Like, or not. And I think there was another one that was like it sort of imagines a society where people are like openly permitted to be racist. I mean, it sort of sounds weird because they are now too, but they're taxed for it, right? And then like all that money goes, it's like like an ongoing reparations. It was like, would you go for it? And I was like, oh, that's a really, I wonder what people think about it. So that's a book I'm looking forward to. So if you got to something that's like everyone should, look at, and something that's like on your want to look at list.
That would be interesting. Yeah. So why don't you send me those recommendations, and how about I send you a few animes to test out?
I've seen the whole Avatar: The Last Airbender. Is that a good like entry point? Just
I gotta say, sometimes I like anime just for the flashing lights and the bang, but other times there are more story-driven, slice of life, dealing with existential dilemmas and complex concepts that most Western TV wouldn't ever bother getting to a story like that.
Yeah. Have you seen? I've watched one. I thought it was pretty good. I think it's called Cyberpunk, but it's actually based on a game world that I've played. It's based on
Oh,
Cyberpunk 2020.
yeah, yeah. That's on Netflix. It's on my
It
watch
is.
list. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I watched the first one and I was like, this is pretty good. So we'll leave it there. Daryl, thank you so much. I think we're gonna have to do another food one and bring some other people. Maybe even
I'm okay with
my
that.
one of my sons, the one who's 19. He's at a farm now. He would love to geek out
That's
about
pretty cool.
food.
So
Yeah.
you know what, Jordy? Next time, why don't we do the food one in person, and we'll do a
Yes.
tasting as well.
Yes. Absolutely. Yes. Absolutely. I may disappoint you though and tell you that I think you're a big fan of lobster. I don't know if you had this conversation, but I'm it's not something I'm gonna pick a lot of fights about, but I kind of think it's overrated.
Uh, I like. I think lobster is fun when you're with people, and you
Sure.
want to and you want to feel special,
Yeah.
But or sometimes when you want to just make a point, and you know that people are watching. Like, is filet mignon really that
No.
miraculous?
No, actually, you're
Or
right. It's not.
exactly. So
Give me a good flank steak. But I will say, especially knowing now about your Trinidadian background, like a steamed or grilled lobster on a beach, accompanied by some tropical fruits, that would be another thing, versus like when people sprinkle lobster and ravioli or something. Like, what are you doing?
yeah, I mean, again, it's for the same reason that the restaurants do it, because it's for the pizzazz, it's for the
Yeah,
zest.
yeah,
It's so you can charge $5 extra,
yeah.
because you're feeding somebody's ego more so than you're feeding their
Right.
stomach.
Right, for sure. All right, my friend. Thank you so much. It was really nice to learn more about you. And this will go out on the podcast feeds too.